In 1979, a 10-year-old boy was hit in the head by a baseball. A few days later, the boy could do something he had never done before. He could say the day of the week for any date in any year, past or future. For example, if you said June 15th, 1770, he would say that was a Friday. If you said April 9th in the year 2266, he would say that's going to be Monday. Now there's a formula and a set of rules to do this calculation, and you can find perpetual calendars on the internet. That's how I got these two examples. But savants with this ability appear to respond instantaneously. They say they just visualize the answer without calculating. But the apparent sudden acquisition of this ability after a head injury is really unusual, and frankly, it's a bit hard to believe. After the baseball injury, this boy could also remember the weather in his hometown for almost every day since the injury. Again, an odd kind of memory, sometimes found in savants, but could these odd abilities really appear suddenly after a head injury? There are similar reports about creativity. One about a man who hit his head against the bottom of a swimming pool after diving in. He claimed to have suddenly developed the ability to play the piano and compose original music after the accident, skills he allegedly did not have before the accident. Such cases are called acquired savant syndrome, and they are exceedingly rare. Most of them are anecdotal, and researchers have investigated very few in any systematic way. They are so rare it's hard to formulate any conclusions about them. There's reasonable skepticism about cases of acquired savant abilities, but there are two kinds of cases where artistic creativity emerged after specific, well-documented brain damage. Both kinds are extremely rare, even more rare than savants, but let's look at them. One kind of acquired savant case involves strokes or brain aneurysms. The other kind involves a type of dementia called frontal temporal dementia. Here's an example. In 1988, a man named John Sarkin had a stroke when he was only 35 years old. The left hemisphere of his brain was severely damaged, and to make matters worse, he developed life-threatening complications that caused surgeons to remove part of his left cerebellum. The cerebellum sits at the very base of the brain, as you see in this illustration. When he recovered, John began to create art and demonstrated a talent he apparently never had before. Here are two examples of John's art. Now, to complicate the story even more, John's artistic drive is obsessive and compulsive. And further, John has also developed bipolar disorder. His moods swing from mania to depression. John's intelligence, however, appears unaffected. John has undergone sophisticated brain imaging at Harvard, including diffusion tensor imaging that we discussed in a previous lecture. The conclusion was John's brain had developed new connections from the remaining parts of the cerebellum to parts of the brain which were not usually connected to the cerebellum. Now, how this happened is unknown, but it could be an important hint about artistic creativity and brain connectivity. You can read details about John in a recent book called Shadows Bright as Glass. Let's go to the second kind of brain damage that's associated with artistic creativity. There's a type of dementia called frontal temporal dementia. This is not Alzheimer's disease, but it's equally devastating, although it's not as common. In a few rare cases of frontal temporal dementia, the patient develops a completely new desire and ability to create art or music. There are some scientific papers published about creativity emerging in patients with frontal temporal dementia, and those papers include brain imaging. The general conclusion is that the subgroup of patients who have more deterioration in the left temporal lobe as the dementia progresses are the ones who are more likely to show new artistic or musical talent. The general idea is that the temporal lobe deterioration disconnects pathways to the frontal lobes, and the frontal lobes become disinhibited. What does disinhibited mean? Well, when your neurons are excited, they fire pulses of information to excite other neurons. Inhibition stops the excitation. Now, the brain is constantly ebbing and flowing between excitation and inhibition. Disinhibition weakens inhibition and results in more excitation. Think about your urge to smack the kid behind you on the airplane who's constantly kicking your seat. It's your inhibitory neurons that stop that urge. If you're disinhibited, there really could be a problem. Now, disinhibition of the frontal lobes also happens with alcohol consumption and some drug use. It may be why LSD makes some people feel creative. Drugs that are used to induce anesthesia often create a stage of disinhibition just before the loss of consciousness, and during this stage, patients say all kinds of things. Dreaming may also be associated with disinhibition of frontal lobes. We'll return to frontal lobe disinhibition and creativity later in this lecture, but first we need to consider how to define creativity for scientific study. Let's think about savants again. Even though savants are very rare, artistic ability is not unusual among savants. Remember, way back in Lecture 1, we talked about Alonzo Clemens, known as the animal sculptor. He has low IQ, but a clear savant ability to sculpt animals in great realistic detail, and he works very quickly, often after just a glance at his subject. Alonzo's mother says he developed this ability after a head injury, but this is not well documented. Whether he had brain damage or not, few would deny Alonzo's artistic ability and talent. What about Alonzo's animal sculptures? They're very literal renditions, but are they creative? Creativity and artistic ability are not necessarily the same thing. Now, the rest of this lecture will be organized into 3 parts. We'll start by addressing issues about defining and measuring creativity for scientific study. The issues are similar to those we addressed about intelligence. Then we'll talk about the relationship between creativity and intelligence, as well as genius and madness. And finally, we'll look at brain imaging studies of creativity and what they show. So, is the scientific study of creativity possible? We started this course by discussing issues about defining intelligence. On one hand, most research strongly supports the concept of a general factor of intelligence that's common to all mental tests and abilities. On the other hand, savants demonstrate that individual mental abilities can exist independently of the general factor. Now, is creativity more like an independent general factor common to various fields, or is it more like a specific mental ability? Are there different creativities? Is there music creativity? Is that different from art creativity? Different from scientific creativity? Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart once said famously about pornography, "It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it." That may well be true also for intelligence. We generally recognize intelligence when we see it, or we certainly easily recognize the lack of it. But is the same true for creativity? Do we know it when we see it? What's the difference between these 2 paintings? On the left, we see a famous and quite valuable work by Jackson Pollock. On the right, we see something that is similar but also quite different. The work on the right is not creative in the same sense as the Pollock work. And in this picture, we have every parent's definition of creative expression. Now, let's be honest, we all still have a stack of these saved in the kids' closet, don't we? And here's another complication of defining creativity. How is it different from intelligence? Consider this. If you're so smart, why aren't you a genius? What are the relationships among creativity, intelligence, and genius? Is a creative genius different from an intelligence genius? Well, let's consider this example. Who has more G and who has more creativity? Bill Gates scored high enough on the SATs to be admitted to Harvard, although he later dropped out to start a company and become the richest man in the world. He actually wrote original computer code himself and personally created early operating systems. As we know, his work became Microsoft. Steve Jobs went to a public university with easier admissions criteria than Harvard, and he also dropped out. He had artistic design opinions and vision. He started and ran a company based on a computer built by his friend Steve Wozniak. But Steve Jobs had the vision and design sense to build Apple into the world's most valuable company. Is visionary the same as creative? Is recognizing creativity in others the same as having creativity yourself? So here's a question. When Bill and Steve had business meetings with their top engineers and executives, were they the smartest guys in the room? That is, who had more G and who had more creativity? Of course, there are different ways to address these questions and no real correct answer, but the point is to highlight the difficulties in defining creativity as something different than intelligence, even if we think we know the difference when we see it. One widely accepted concept is that creativity typically involves the production of something novel and useful or valuable. Certainly, it's novel to build a house over a waterfall instead of building it oriented to see the waterfall, and certainly a house is useful. This house on the waterfall is one of the reasons Frank Lloyd Wright is regarded as a creative genius. By the way, if you're ever near Pittsburgh, it's worth a side trip to see this house. And if you haven't noticed, my tie is inspired by a Frank Lloyd Wright design. Now, here are some other famous buildings. All are useful, all creative in their time, but often the most creative ones are not well received by many people. However, useful is difficult to apply to art, for example, although art can be valuable both in terms of emotional enjoyment and in terms of money. Usefulness and value, of course, depend on the social context, and that's always changing. Which of these two images is more creative or useful? It depends. Classic work of artistic genius or classic work of advertising genius. We could spend all day with countless examples. If creativity and creative genius are totally subjective and dependent on cultural context, a scientific understanding would be quite elusive. But if that were the case, this lecture would not be part of this course. So now let's look at some measures of creativity and how they relate to intelligence. Let's start with this simple question. Is there a minimum cutoff of IQ necessary for creativity? The threshold theory basically says an IQ above 120 is necessary for creativity. Over 120, some theorize that additional IQ doesn't increase creativity, whereas others think the most creativity is likely in the very highest IQ range. Remember the Hopkins study of mathematically and scientifically precocious youth from our earlier lecture? The Hopkins follow-up studies tested this idea. They defined scientific creativity objectively by the number of published works and patents the original talent search participants had 25 years after they took the SAT math at age 13. I showed this chart back in that lecture 5. Now I call your attention to the outcomes of publications and patents. The top quartile has more of these than the others in the top 1%. Bottom line, these data support the idea that highest scores predict more creativity defined in terms of objective accomplishments, even in the very highest end of the distribution. Now let's look at 3 specific tests that researchers use to measure creativity. The first one is called the Remote Associates Test. This test assesses the ability to see unusual associations and connections between common things. Because the associations required are unusual, they're called remote associations. Here are some examples of items like those found on this test. The question for you is, what new word is associated with the three words I'm about to read? Here are the three words: slide, band, quarry. Slide, band, quarry. The answer is rock. Rock slide, rock band, and rock quarry. Here's another. Ready? Cottage, Swiss, cake. Cottage, Swiss, cake. The answer is cheese. Cottage cheese, Swiss cheese, and cheesecake. You may find this fairly simple. Actually, there are wide individual differences among people on this test. For example, in a research study that used items like this, but not actual test items, 52% of people got the cheese answer within 2 seconds, and 96% got this answer within 15 seconds. Here's another one, perhaps a bit harder. Do, comb, bee. Do, comb, bee. The answer is honey. Honey-dew melon, honeycomb, and honeybee. 30% of people got this one within 2 seconds, and only 66% got it within 15 seconds. And here's our last example. Roll, bean, fish. Roll, bean, fish. The answer is jelly. Jelly roll, jelly bean, and jellyfish. Interestingly, for this one, 0% got this answer within 2 seconds, and only 11% got it within 15 seconds. You can easily see that this test requires basic knowledge that may or may not be current. But in addition to good vocabulary, which is correlated to IQ, you also need to be able to associate things that may not be obvious. Is this really creativity? Researchers think this is at least one component of creativity, as measured by the remote associates test. The second test is called the uses of objects test. Researchers use this test as a measure of divergent thinking. That is, divergent thinking is what is often meant when you, quote, think out of the box. This test also taps the fluency of unusual ideas, which is another aspect of the creative process. Linus Pauling, for example, a winner of the Nobel Prize, actually he won 2 Nobel Prizes for 2 different scientific discoveries. Linus once said, quote, "In order to have a good idea, you must have many ideas," end quote. The uses of objects test gives a person 60 seconds to list novel and creative uses of a common object, like a brick, for example. Here are some ideas for using a brick. There's a doorstop, a water saver in a toilet tank, a paperweight, a bug smasher, an exercise weight. The actual test includes other items in addition to a brick, and a person's responses are rated for creativity using some standard criteria that have been developed. So after this lecture, take a minute and write down all the creative uses you can imagine for, let's say, a nail. Now, this test has also been used with brain imaging, as we'll see shortly. The third test asks a person to think of a creative caption for ambiguous pictures like this one. This is actually quite difficult, even if you're a fan of New Yorker cartoons. Now, you can see that scoring these tests requires ratings and some consensus about what is creative. This is really not as objective as most scores on intelligence tests, and certainly not like measuring temperature or liquids. There's quite a bit of research using such tests, but I want to focus on relatively recent work that aims at understanding creativity in the brain. There are many popular books about creativity and how to increase it or unleash it. As far as I know, there's no compelling research that supports any measurable increase in creativity due to brain exercises. There's also a popular idea about creativity that focuses on a distinction between right brain and left brain. The general idea is that creativity comes from the right hemisphere and rationality is a function of the left hemisphere. We see this idea illustrated dramatically here, and also here more artistically. The right-left brain idea is very general, and it's based mostly on patients with brain damage. As we saw in functional brain imaging studies of intelligence, information flows throughout the entire brain. One hemisphere may be more involved than the other for any particular problem solving, but whether creativity depends more on the right hemisphere is really still an open question that can ultimately be tested with brain imaging. Now, brain imaging studies of creativity are just getting started, probably because the tests and measures of creativity are not as well developed as intelligence tests and measures. Whereas the G factor has proved to be a useful framework for intelligence studies, there's not yet a comparable empirical finding for creativity. And as we've seen, even defining creativity is more difficult than defining intelligence. My colleague Rex Jung at the University of New Mexico has focused much of his recent brain imaging research on creativity and how creativity may relate to our PFIT model of intelligence. Although I've helped on some of these studies, he's really the expert on creativity and the brain. And here's one of the first studies that measured the thickness of the cortex at many points throughout the brain, and then correlated thickness to scores on a creativity index. The index was a combination of scores on 3 creativity tests, including the uses of objects test that we discussed earlier. 65 college students completed the structural MRI imaging and the creativity tests. Here are the results. Each panel shows a different view of the brain. These views are based on templates that were created by mathematically inflating the brain, like blowing up a balloon to reveal the inner folds of the cortex. The statistical results are shown here in red and blue. Red shows a positive correlation where a thicker cortex goes with higher creativity scores, and blue shows where a thinner cortex goes with higher creativity scores. The right panel shows a side view of the right hemisphere where the frontal lobe is toward the right, and the left panel shows the left hemisphere. There are only a few brain areas where there's a statistical relationship. By comparison, intelligence findings are really much more dramatic. But the main point of this study, in showing you this, is that gray matter in the cortex can be related to a creativity index, and this suggests that neuroscience investigations of creativity are possible. This is only one early study, and the results are quite preliminary. Now here's more data from the same New Mexico study using diffusion tensor imaging of white matter tracts that connect brain areas to each other. This is a side view of the brain right down the middle. The frontal lobes are toward the right. The arrow points to specific white matter tracts shown in orange that are related to the creativity index. Now I need to emphasize that the interpretation of these data are actually quite complex, but this is additional evidence that brain structure is related to creativity. There are now a number of functional imaging studies that have used various measures related to one or another aspect of creativity. The field is somewhat like the imaging studies of intelligence several years ago when we extracted some common findings across disparate studies to formulate the PFIT model. Here's an idea of what some of the creativity data look like from different studies. These are brain slices as if we cut through from front to back parallel to the ground. The upper left of this picture starts at the top of the brain, and we move down from left to right to the very bottom of the brain in the bottom row. On the right is the lowest part of the brain. Each color symbol represents results from different creativity studies. You can see very little overlap, suggesting not much in common from study to study. This is a bit discouraging for developing a PFIT-like model for creativity, at least until we have more data. However, I do want to draw your attention to the blue triangles in the very bottom row. They are in the cerebellum and come from a study of artistic ability. Remember the case of John Sarkin from the beginning of this lecture? He had parts of his left cerebellum removed, and subsequently he developed a new artistic ability. So, I also want to tell you about an intriguing new study that used fMRI, functional MRI, to study rappers. That's hip-hop rap musicians. A group of 12 professional freestyle rappers did 2 tasks during functional MRI. The control task was rapping lyrics based on specific words memorized for this experiment to a pre-selected instrumental track. The second task was rapping improvised lyrics to the same instrumental track. This image shows some of the differences between the 2 tasks. Here we see the outer surface of the left and right hemispheres. Orange shows where improvised rapping had greater brain activity, and blue shows where improvised rapping had less activity. Now, we can't overinterpret any one study, but this nicely shows you how the scientific study of creativity is progressing. So to summarize, a number of researchers are working on brain imaging studies of creativity. Some findings overlap with brain areas related to intelligence. Other creativity areas appear separate from intelligence networks. Some findings are consistent with the idea that disinhibition of the frontal lobes plays a major role, although there may be several ways for the frontal lobes to become disinhibited. Some studies are consistent with rare observations of savant brain damage. But the bottom line is that how we go from this to this is still a mystery. The good news is that creativity, with all its complexities, can be studied scientifically. And if we understand the brain mechanisms involved in the creative process, we may be able to find ways to increase creativity, or perhaps even to induce creativity where it never existed before. This is the same hope we have for enhancing intelligence. But we may actually be closer for intelligence, as we'll see in the next lecture.